I've been tracking this whole tampon recall business very closely. I've saved every article, even though they are extremely limited. I've collected any testimony I can find online. It's an important issue for me for many reasons. The first being I'm a woman and I happen to menstruate every month. The second thing, I was one of the 60% of women affected by this recall. I've decided to document my exact experience in case something even worse starts to happen. I bet a lot of you reading this have had similar experience with the recall. If so, please let me know you're not alone. I live in America, so I can only speak from my own experience, although I know similar events occurred in the UK, Canada, and other countries. I was offered large sums of money to keep my story quiet. We all were, but I am not taking their money. Women died because of this. I saw a woman waste away in front of me and they want me to shut up? Never. I don't care what happens now. It was last November when I started experiencing the symptoms. Now, take into account I've been using tampons since I was 15. I know all about toxic shock syndrome and basic hygiene. I am no menstruation newbie. But that month, I started experiencing something odd. I got my period near the first, like I typically do. However, about a day into my period, I started feeling an intense itching sensation. It wasn't a normal itch. It felt like someone was dragging a rake down the inside of my vagina. I wasn't worried it was an STD since I hadn't had sex in almost a year. I spent the whole day at work uncomfortable, squirming around in my chair. I couldn't wait to get home. When I finally did, I drew a bath, I took off my clothes, took out my tampon, and lowered myself into the water. The warm water made everything much better. I breathed a sigh of relief. It must have been a weird reaction to something. I got out, put in a new tampon, and went to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night in extreme pain. The itching was back, but now it was more like razors. I pulled away my covers to see my lower half was covered in blood. I screamed and tried to get to the bathroom, but my legs were too wobbly from the pain. I ended up crawling there, sobbing. It seriously felt like someone was cutting me up from the inside. I managed to kneel down by my bathtub and fill it with water. I reached down tentatively, afraid that taking out the tampon would cause me even more pain. I slid it out and stared. The tampon looked as if it had been ripped apart while it was inside of me. I got into the bathtub, but the pain didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. I remember getting lightheaded. I realized that the blood filling up the tub wasn't just my period. I must have wounds inside my vagina that were bleeding heavily. I was losing too much blood. The water was drawing it all out of me, and my mind was getting fuzzy. I blacked out. Thank God my neighbor heard me screaming and called 911. I woke up in the hospital. My legs were in stirrups. The pain had dulled. Although I could still feel an ache come from between my legs, I moaned in agony. My sounds must have alerted the doctor, who shuffled over to me. I looked up at him. What happened to me? He frowned and checked one of the machines I was hooked up to. You lost a lot of blood. You can't get into bath if you got a cut that deep. That's how people kill themselves. He sighed. You're the 13th woman to be admitted here with these kinds of wounds. Can you tell me what happened? Nothing happened. It just started suddenly. Let me guess, are you menstruating? I squinted at him. Yeah. Did you use a tampon? Yeah. And that's when he told me about the recall. Apparently, it hadn't gone public yet, but companies had already alerted the Surgeon General that they were about to announce a worldwide recall of all tampons. The Surgeon General had alerted hospitals that they may see an influx of patients with extreme wounds inside their vaginas. Bastards, right? I was too injured to go home, so I stayed at the hospital. My wounds were not getting any better. A doctor would stitch me up, thank God for morphine, but within a few hours the stitches would be broken. They ruled out a rash and knew I wasn't doing it to myself. A nurse told me that by my second day, there were 40 other women in the same condition. I learned later that 2 women had already died by then. I was terrified. I had no idea what was wrong with me, and the pain was horrible. If it weren't for the drugs they gave me, I might not have made it. It was 10 days later that the press conference was held. I watched it from my bed. I was now always hooked up with pints of new blood since I kept losing so much. By this time, I wasn't menstruating anymore. It was all blood lost from the cuts that kept ripping up my vagina. The woman who gave the press conference wore a neat pink skirt suit. She rapped, but all the brands were giving the same speech. She said that something had contaminated the entire stock of tampons. She called it an unfortunate event. She recommended that anyone who had used a tampon in the past month should report immediately to a hospital. She said that although there were extreme medical concerns associated with the tampon use, there was a cure. It was called Ophiocordyceps unilateralis. I figured it was the technical medical term for some drug. She apologized once, only once, and then the press conference was over. After the broadcast, the hospital was filled with women. They didn't have enough rooms for everyone. Eventually, there were 2 cots brought into my room, and now I had 2 roommates. Their names were Mary and Justine. I was honestly grateful for the company. Mary was in terrible shape. She had used the tampons for her entire period, almost 7 days, and she ignored the pain and bleeding. She had no insurance, so she didn't go to a hospital. Justine told me that the infection had spread to her uterus and it was most likely loose in her body. Mary's skin was gray and she was always crying. The doctor gave her as much pain meds as possible, but it didn't help. Justine and I would talk lightly while Mary sobbed in her bed. They gave us the cure as soon as it arrived to the hospital. It was contained in a pill that we were supposed to insert inside our vaginas. The pill would disintegrate and the medicine would be absorbed. Of course, the insertion was incredibly painful, but I just wanted this horror to end. No one told us. No one said what would happen. No one told us exactly what was going on. That's why they offered all of us a settlement after it was over. If we stay quiet, they can rebuild. But what I saw that night will live with me forever. Once the suppository was in place, the doctor left our room and closed the door. It was a bit weird that he closed the door, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I made some dumb joke about this being the most action I've got in months. Justine laughed, I think. Mary was whimpering. A few hours passed, we watched TV and chatted aimlessly. Right around 11 p.m., Justine said that she felt something weird. I looked over at her and she was twitching. I asked her if I should call the nurse, but my mouth went dry. I could see them coming out under her gown. There must have been thousands of tiny ants crawling out of her. She began to scream. They moved with robotic symmetry, all of them following each other out from between her legs. They crawled up her body onto her face. She tried to swat them off of her, but there were too many. They all crawled to the top of her head and sat there. They were covered in blood. They tracked blood on her skin as they crawled. I pushed the nurse button again and again, but no one came. Yells were echoing from the other rooms as well. Then Mary started to scream. I was afraid to look, but I couldn't take my eyes away. Ants started crawling out of her as well, but they also seemed to come from other places. Then it dawned on me. They were eating through her skin to get to the surface. The infection had spread so much of her body that the ants were everywhere, digging their way up to the top of her head. I watched in horror as one ant burrowed out of her eye. She stopped screaming and started gurgling. I'm ashamed to say, but I looked away. She was going to die from this. It happened to me too, but I don't want to go into detail. Just know it was the worst thing to have ever happened to me. I can't sleep because I still see them crawling over my skin, leaving marks of red all over me. I can't go an hour without feeling like they're still crawling on me. No amount of money will erase those memories. It turns out Ophiocordyceps unilateralis is a fungus. It eats ants from the inside and takes a hold of their brains. It makes them go to the highest point they can before killing the ant. The Surgeon General must have been forced to use this because the ants would burrow so deep in our bodies that typical methods couldn't possibly remove them. The doctors knew the entire time that we had ants inside of us, but said nothing. The tampon rep said nothing. They allowed us to suffer by ourselves in the unknown. Bastards. Like most women affected, I have lasting damage. My vagina is scarred and sex is nearly impossible. Even worse, I will never be able to carry children. For weeks afterwards, a lone ant would climb out of me, finally submitting to the fungus. I used to worry that I would never get rid of them. We have no idea what effect the fungus will have on us. I heard a rumor in my support group that an affected woman climbed to the top of a telephone pole before dying, just like the ants. Needless to say, I don't use tampons anymore.
This is your demise. You